When non-goth people hear the word goth, there is a series of stereotypes that tend to fly through their minds, and through no fault of their own, we're not always exactly forthcoming with what exactly the subculture is about. Typically speaking, if you ask somebody who is not goth to describe a goth person to you, they will say something about their appearance before anything else. Most of the ideas they have of what a goth person is will consist of the broody, no smile ever, dressed all in black, ignoring all of the normies around them while reading page after page of Edgar Allan Poe Wednesday Addams stereotype. So with non-goth people, the idea of a goth person kind of directly lies in the idea of what they look like at surface level, what their appearance is. Whereas if you ask a goth person what a goth person is, everything will come down to the music. Everything is about, oh, you have to love these goth bands and you need to really respect where the subculture began back in the 80s as the post-punk movement and everything. It's all about the music. It's kind of funny to me because both people in the gothic subculture and people outside of it have kind of constricted us and squashed us into this little box of what goth is to them. And if you really take a moment to think about it, goth isn't really either of those things. Despite the protests you'll hear from certain people, goth does not only deal with the way someone looks. Goth does not only deal with whether or not you enjoy listening to goth music. There's more to it than that. Despite the protestation you will hear from people who are really, really into the goth subculture, it can't really be just about the music. You can't build an entire subculture of people off of one tiny aspect of who they are. It doesn't make any sense. Yes, the music is, of course, extremely important. The music is, after all, where the subculture originated, but that is not the only aspect of being goth. If you were trying to apply that logic to it, then literally anyone who happens to like a lot of 80s music and ends up enjoying the music that just so happens to have been written by the people that began the goth movement, then you could have people walking around in pink t-shirts, blonde pigtails, and flared jeans who were considered goth just because they enjoyed the music. And most people in the goth subculture wouldn't necessarily appreciate you just deciding that anyone who listens to it is a goth, whether they look like it or not. But by the same token, you can't decide that every single person who has crazy colored hair, really over-the-top makeup, and who likes to wear black on a daily basis is goth either. Because there are a lot of different alternative subcultures. You've got emo, you've got punk, you've got metal, you've got everything. And people don't want to get boxed in. We don't belong in storage lockers. We're supposed to be free to express ourselves in whatever way we so choose. The reason I'm bringing all of this up is because I think it's kind of funny that when you look at videos on YouTube that have anything to do with goth people, you're basically just going to see videos about the clothing that goth people like and the music they like to hear. You don't really hear that much outside that besides maybe, you know, stories in their everyday life about how people react to them or the night they had at the club. But there's so much more to it than that. I mean, when you really get down to the bare bones, a person who is goth, besides just enjoying goth music, is someone who tends to see the beauty in darkness, the beauty in things that most people would find morbid or terrible or ugly. We just find them lovely or fun in some way that a lot of people can't see. So it kind of makes me laugh that a lot of people don't really talk about goth movies, their favorite goth movies. And it's so funny because there isn't really a genre specifically for goth people. There's movies that, you know, people have just decided over the years are definitely goth movies, but we never really decided that. People kind of decided it for us for the most part, and you certainly can't go into Hulu or Netflix and just go, where are the goth movies at today? And it's so funny because a lot of people think of certain movies and they're like, yes, that's definitely a goth movie. Whether they are goth or not, everyone just kind of decides, yeah, I'm fine with that analysis. But then there's other ones that non-goth people assign to us, and goth people are just like, no, don't say that's a goth movie. So I always wonder, what is it that makes a certain movie goth or not goth? What are the criteria for a movie to be considered a goth movie? Because I guarantee you, if you asked a random person on the street right now, so what do you think is the #1 goth movie ever created? They're gonna say The Crow. And you will hear a resounding groan from almost every goth within a 50-mile radius, because although you may see the movie The Crow and think, well, shouldn't it be like in every goth's top 10? It's dark, it's moody, it has this very goth-looking main character, it has a lot of poetic beauty that deals with dark themes and themes of death and things that most people find morbid but that most goth people find lovely. How is it not a favorite movie? And honestly, the most basic response to that is just, when the movie came out, a lot of people just kind of fashioned themselves after Eric Draven and just decided that, oh, he's just like the archetype of a goth man now. And it got to a point where there was just no creativity behind it anymore. There was no personalization in that look anymore. Everyone just said, ooh, he's cool, he's like king of the goths now, let's all look like him. So even though there are goths who enjoy it, like, honestly, it's one of my favorite films. I think it's a wonderful movie, and I still love it very much, despite everything that's gone on in the subculture around it. People don't really want to hear that that's, like, the #1 goth movie, just because of that stuff I just mentioned. Something else you might automatically assume is goth cinema is pretty much anything created by Tim Burton, because Tim Burton is like the peak of the mountain when it comes to creative people who focus their work around darker themes. I mean, pretty much all of his movies revolve around the subject of death and the afterlife and just dying and how people react to a sudden death in their life. I mean, it's difficult to find a Tim Burton film that doesn't have a theme of death or dying around it. And it's interesting because although most people think Tim Burton and they think of these really outlandish and avant-garde movies like Corpse Bride and Nightmare Before Christmas, I argue those are not his best films. They might be some of his most popular films, but they're certainly not the most creative and profound films he's made. I would argue that his more profound films are Edward Scissorhands and Big Fish, and a lot of people forget that Big Fish even exists because it didn't really do as well as some of his other movies. But once again, rather than having these crazy, noisy, flamboyant characters in the land of the dead, everything in Big Fish takes place during the characters' lives and different points in their lives. It's about a man who is in the process of dying, who's looking back at his life. And I just found it interesting that that one is so the same yet different from everything that he's really done. It still has the idea of death, but the beauty behind the death isn't the crazy music and the bright colors of something like Beetlejuice. It's very subtle. It's not as grandiose as his other movies. It's mostly just kind of a fantasy version of somebody's entire life journey, and the beauty behind it is the fact that the main character is embracing his death. He knows it's coming, he doesn't fear it, he doesn't have really any regrets besides the fact that he hasn't been able to explain to his son why he came off so distant, and why the things that he's said might sound crazy to other people, but why they're so real to him. And it's just very poetic in a sense that it kind of tells you it's okay, don't be afraid of what's coming after, just worry about right now. So I would definitely agree that Tim Burton films are definitely a good example of Gothic cinema, but not for the reasons that most people think they are, not because of the black clad people and the themes of skeletons walking around in the reality of the story, more because of things like the themes in Big Fish and Edward Scissorhands. A couple of franchises that a lot of people tend to lump into goth cinema are the Blade and Underworld series, and once again, although we do enjoy movies like Blade and Underworld and What We Do in the Shadows and pretty much anything involving vampires and creepy supernatural and paranormal creatures, having those elements in a film doesn't necessarily make it a gothic film. This is one of those tricky, sticky areas because while there are dark themes to them, I mean, you've got things like vampire wars in Underworld and kind of a satirical look at the normal documentaries you see in What We Do in the Shadows. I would argue that although these movies have certain character types that goth people would enjoy, they're not really goth movies. Nothing about them thematically really speaks to what the goth subculture is all about. You're not really finding beauty in darker things. You're not really finding the calm serenity in the process of dying in the afterlife. It's really just, these fun romps through fantastical worlds that just happen to be a little more geared towards like horror and horror comedy than something like Twilight. Another example of a movie that a lot of people would consider to be a goth movie that I argue isn't is The Craft. While there is a stereotypical goth looking character in The Craft, again, nothing about it is really goth centered. You can't just find a goth character in a movie and decide it makes it a goth movie. That's not really how it works. It still has to fit those themes that most goth people enjoy, and that one is more a cautionary tale of using Wiccan magic for your own will and bending the will of others to do your bidding. The threefold law and how it's going to come back and bite you if you don't pay enough attention to it. Funny enough, although I just got done mentioning how movies like The Craft and the Underworld series and the Blade series are not exactly goth movies, they're just movies that happen to have a couple of different types of characters gothic people would enjoy, I would argue that Rocky Horror Picture Show is a goth movie, because we're circling back to things like Tim Burton movies where, although it's very peppy and upbeat in a lot of ways in the way that its music sounds, once again, we're kind of embracing the fun of death and people who are kind of terrible, honestly. I mean, everything is just a big gothic stereotype in that movie, and it's hilariously done to a point where you can't even be mad at it for kind of making fun of, things that a lot of gothic people enjoy, and making fun of like old Hollywood horror movies and those really crappy 1960s B movies. But the fact that you've got, the main character who definitely has that 80s goth look to him, and you've got these characters who are trying to argue with Brad and Janet that you should be happy, this is a fun place, and they're like, everyone's like obsessed with death here, how is that fun? And that's very much how a goth person's life is. You're just like, how can you not enjoy this? How can you not think this is fun? And everyone else is like, what is wrong with you? And then you have things like the upcoming Vampire Chronicles series that Anne Rice is working on. This is another one of those gray, tricky areas because people will get very confused about why I would consider the Vampire Chronicles series a goth series, but not the Underworld series. It's because Underworld is more firmly rooted in the war and the battle and the horror elements more than anything gothic in the story. Whereas Vampire Chronicles, there is not so much like running around, punching each other, killing each other type action sequences. It's very nuanced, it's very calm, and just Lestat as a character and Louis as a character already very gothic. If you've read the books, which is what the TV series is going to be based off of, because Anne Rice has made sure she has creative control this time, so that's going to be exactly what she wants it to be, you'll see all those gothic elements, the locations, the look of the characters, the way that they think and feel. All of these are very, very goth elements, even down to the fact that when Lestat wakes up in the 80s, the music that he wants to create and produce is definitely inspired by the gothic movement. You can tell that it is. I mean, you just look at the lyrics she wrote for him, it's like, yeah, the Sisters of Mercy would have done something like that. And the fact that Lestat can't understand why Louis is so unhappy as a vampire. He can't understand why it's so depressing to him to have this eternal life that's also eternal death. He's like, but this is beautiful. We can be together forever. It's this wonderful, unending bond that nothing can sever. And Louis is just like, but I'm fucking dead. This isn't fun at all. And once again, it's kind of this perfect balance of Louis almost as a non-goth person trying to understand why a goth person enjoys all of these darker parts of life, and Lestat being more the goth person who can't understand why Louis can't enjoy his way of life. It's kind of fun when you like look at some of the media that is very much for goth people, and you see that there's always characters who are trying to prove the point that a gothic lifestyle really isn't that terrible, and the people who disagree with them trying to understand why they think that. Apart from everything I've already mentioned, something that I don't really hear a lot of goth people talking about, but that I would definitely put at like the very top of my list, if someone sat down with me right this second and said, all right, right off the bat, if you had to mention the best creator of gothic cinema, who would you name? It's actually Guillermo del Toro for me. A lot of people have still not even really heard of him, unfortunately. A lot of people haven't seen most of his work. They might have heard of a couple of things he did, but they haven't heard of most of his better works. I have watched everything from the lesser-known Devil's Backbone to the very much-known Pan's Labyrinth by him, and I think that he is a beautiful curator of gothic cinema. Everything about his works just speaks to anything a goth person loves. Though all that he has left is just to put goth songs in his movies and he's set. I mean, it's just beautiful. Once again, it's the same as anybody else I've mentioned who does actual goth cinema and not just a stereotype. Everything is just this creative way of looking at the afterlife and these creatures that most people would have found terrifying, but that the main characters seem to not really be afraid of. They're not really bothered by them. They think it's lovely, it's wonderful. People are confronted by ghosts who are not supposed to be the stereotypical, like, boo, I'm so scary, I'm in a horror movie. They're usually this really sad, but I know I keep saying beautiful, but I mean, it's after midnight right now and I'm trying to record a video, so sorry about not having many more descriptive words than that. Sad but beautiful warnings, people who are trying to lead them through so that their life and their afterlife can be nicer than the ghosts currently is. I think that Del Toro actually ticks a lot of the boxes when it comes to the art of what he creates, the poetry behind it, and when you really listen to the things his characters are saying, it really speaks to the Gothic mind and the Gothic heart, and just that beauty and darkness that all of us crave so much. He just nails it in every single movie that he makes, and I really wish that he was more beloved and more well known than he currently is. It's really sad to me that so many people still maybe have seen some of his movies but don't know his name, and that he'll have the beginning of a screenplay created or something and get dropped by whatever studio he's supposed to be making movies for, because at the end of the day, people just still don't understand why some of us love the things that we do. They don't understand how we can find some of these monstrous and dark and dead things so wonderful, and perhaps they never will, and that's the reason why people like Del Toro are not as widely accepted by Hollywood and not as well understood and loved as some of the larger scale directors and producers that you see. I don't know, I wasn't really planning on making this video with the purpose of teaching anyone anything. I just thought it would be fun because I was surprised to see that a lot of people don't really talk about movies that either people think are for goth people and really aren't, or that goth people are like, that's for me, that's definitely something I love. So I thought it was kind of a fun topic to bring some light to. So let me know what your favorite movies are that you would consider goth. Let me know if anyone ever like tried to argue with you that like, that's not a goth movie, that's for everyone or something, or that they tried to argue with you, no, that is definitely a goth movie, and you just completely disagreed with them. And let me know what you think the criteria is for a good goth movie. Do you think that it has to have goth music in it? Do you think that it has to have certain thematic elements or certain types of characters? What makes a movie goth to you? Because something tells me we're all going to have a different answer, and I'm going to have a lot of fun reading that. But I hope you had fun tonight with me, and as always, do something that makes you happy today, no matter what anyone else thinks about it, and I will see all of you again soon.